ultimately important for us to either do an investigation or recovery. So we need some piece of information to help us go forward. So I've been talking about how we work with other countries. Internal to USG, we also have to work as well. So although DPA is the agency responsible for past conflict personnel accounting, we have to work with our partners inside of DoD, Department of Defense, inside of DOS, Department of State, NSC, National Security Council, we work with them as well. And so it's a complex problem that takes us working with the accounting community to make sure our mission is pushed forward. You know most of these, I'd say, or you have engaged with some of them. For example, the SCOs, the Service Casualty Officers. I was doing registration with most of you today, and the Service Casualties walked you all to your table. You have one-on-ones with them. We work with them on a regular basis to make sure we have communication with you. They have the FRS prioritization that we're looking for, and so we're always working with them. AFMES is another partner that we work with. They're responsible for AFDIL, and they recover those FRS that you send. They wind up taking that and analyzing it and hopefully giving us another method for us to conduct an identification. As I've alluded to, Department of State is up there, Department of Defense, and the NSC, all our interagency partners that we work with as well to make sure that our mission is pushed forward. So, policy, what is it, right? So, Exec SecDef Mattis, he previously stated that policy imposes reason over impulse. Okay, this speaks to deliberate planning to achieve the highest level of success possible. So inside of plans and policy, we take that on board where we take our strategic guidance from our leadership and we wind up making strategic plans and operational plans which wind up helping the REs to focus their efforts to make the mission work. We also develop the requirements to implement the federal statutes governing our mission, and this is accomplished through drafting DoD directives and instructions. So some of those impact just us, but some of them also impact the accounting community. So there's a lot of collaboration that goes on, again, a lot of engagement with our partners, both USG and non-USG, to make sure that we're tracking our mission is pushed in the forefront. So in short, policy provides the basis to enable operators to do their job, right? So that's where we come in. Some key policy initiatives and functions. So the first step in conducting operations in any country is engagement. So it takes that first step to engage with those countries. To accomplish this, inside of DPA, we've came up with a foreign engagement and access policy. This policy formulates how we engage at the highest levels of government and support all operations throughout DPA. So this includes joint field activities, archival research, establishing memorandum of understanding with foreign governments, national budgeting, and on and on. It incorporates all of our engagements to wind up giving us a platform to move ourselves forward. This policy synchronizes engagement opportunities, ties USG concerns, policies, and objectives to the regional directorate actions. Essentially, this ensures maximum synchronization across the agency and effective use of our resources. There's only so many engagements we can do, so we have to make sure strategically we're engaging at the appropriate time with what we have. As I've talked to you, you see on the slide there's interagency and interdepartmental coordination. That's Department of State, DoD, all our interactions with them. It takes a lot of interactions, collaboration across the accounting community to make sure that our policy is in effect and we're impacting us in a good way. Finally, the disinterment program. So this is growing and is resulting for more accounted for each year than any other operation we undertake. We have 3 major projects. We got the USS Oklahoma, the Korean War Project, and Ploesti. We also review our process internally and externally to ensure that that disinterment process is efficient, effective, and we're using our time wisely to get those cases pushed forward, disinterred, and hopefully ID'd. So, quick brief, that completes my presentation. I hope this gave you a short glimpse into the plans and policy, how we interact in the accounting community mission. Stepping aside from that, I'm a Naval Flight Officer, and I would just like to say it's a real honor being here. In the Remembrance Ceremony, I heard people saying, thank you for this opportunity, it's a real honor. No, I would say it's a real honor for me to serve this mission for you, as I think all the military would agree. So I'd say thank you. You guys keep the press showing up to this. I think Mr. Livick talking to the young man here, that's what we have to do, keep pushing that. So thank you for your time. If you have any questions, I'll be around all day. I really look forward to engaging with each one of you and answering any questions. Thank you for your time.
Good morning. My name's Gregory Berg. I am one of the recovery leaders and laboratory managers out at DPAA. I'm going to be giving you the laboratory brief, so in keeping with good tradition, I've got my science socks on, and this is your time to put your science hats on, and I'm going to go over some science with you guys about what the laboratory does, okay? Here we go. So, recovery and identification. 4 major topics I'm going to cover are going to be field operations, laboratory operations, how we package together, how we put together an identification, and then what all those special projects that he just started talking about, some of those disinterment projects, how those are coming along and what we're seeing in the future, okay? So I'm telling you what I'm telling you, I'm going to tell you what I told you or something. I forget how all that teaching stuff goes, but that's where we're headed today. So first up, field. In the field, we do archaeological recoveries, but we also focus on disinterment activities. Archaeology is done by DPAA across the world. We specialize in excavating sites, no matter where they are. They can be on a glacier in Alaska, they can be in a swamp in Papua New Guinea. All of those are led by a scientific recovery leader who usually is a PhD or an MA archaeologist or anthropologist, and they direct the excavation of each site. Prior to ever going out, we're going to do some research and analysis, done in-house and also out-of-house. But those initial ideas formulate what's going to happen in the field. We also do disinterments, and most of those focus, as you can see right there, the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, which is right there in our backyard, Punch Bowl, but also at all ABMC cemeteries across the world. So archaeological recoveries are detailed excavations that control data. One of the things that you all have to know about archaeology, if you don't remember this from, I don't know, 6th grade, did you practice digging up something in a sandbox? No one ever did that? Oh man, was I the only guy that did that? Oh, I love that. It's destructive. You can only dig a site one time. We get one shot at this. You can't go back and dig up something that you already dug up, right? So, in order to do that right, we have to understand everything about what we're doing, particularly the spatial relationships between the things that we find and where we found them, and what the environment may have impacted upon those items. Okay, so we're experts at understanding dirt, believe it or not. We can see dirt, we read dirt. So like this is dirt, right? You guys look at that and you're like, hey, look, dirt. Wow, dirt. To me, that's like a birthday cake. That can you see the layers in there, all the different layers of the birthday cake? Right? Oh, here, I'll highlight them for you. Okay, there you go. That's what I look at when I see that. I see multiple layers across this. I even see where my cousin Freddie stuck his finger into the cake right there and disturbed it all. That's what we read as archaeologists. We can see that there's a layer of topsoil, how that's been impacted over time. Then I can see I've got an incident layer right there that has artifacts associated to a case bearing in it. And then I can see the bottom part where it shifts down to a sterile soil. And there's nothing that I need to look at there because I know that that hasn't been disturbed in 10,000 years. So that's how we read that. And that's what we are trained to do and what we specialize in doing when we're in the field. So here is another perfect example of dirt. Can you see the differences in soil color there? It's a slide, it's hard to see, but you've got a lighter mass in the center and you've got some oranger stuff on the top and on the bottom. That outline that forms around there is marking out a burial location. Sometimes these are really easy to see. This to me is really clear. Other times it's really tough to understand that, and when you open that up, you can see how that just changed, right? Oh, go back. So that's what we do, and that's how we get to where we're going to begin the process of case closure for you. Other times, it's really evident where you're digging that you've got something related to a case. For instance, this is a site in Papua New Guinea, and we dug over, I think it was 7 acres on this. But that map there is the crucial part to this. What I said before about understanding spatial places and spatial relationships. So this map is our way of controlling the world in archaeology to understand where we need to go in order to maximize the recovery effort. When we dug this site, you can see there's distinct pockets that are outlined there on that map of where things were found. Based on that, we can make decisions whether or not to expand or contract so that we spend more time in the right spot and less time in a wrong spot. Does that all make sense? Cool, I'm doing my job so far. All right, good. We do this, like I said, everywhere. We use different types of tools to make our jobs easier. We use small little track hoes, we use giant backhoes, we use folks on a shovel, we use guys with suction hoses down on the bottom of the ocean. And a lot of times what we do is we spend hundreds, thousands of man hours standing next to a screen, pushing all that dirt that we pulled out of a site through a 1/4-inch mesh, looking for the smallest little bit of evidence that we can find. Shifting gears a little bit, when we do disinterment activities, we usually focus on ABMC cemeteries or national monuments, and we'll go in and we'll excavate one of those, but we know where we're looking, right? We're looking for an unknown that's got a marked grave. So that's relatively not needing our expertise so much as it is needing our historians' expertise. Setting up the conditions to make sure that we are excavating, exhuming the right coffin with a case background that will lead to case closure. So this is the other type of excavation we do. Okay, we're good. We now understand how we get materials into the laboratory, so now I'm going to walk you through what the laboratory is. We are an accredited laboratory, one of only 2 across DoD that is accredited to do the work that we do. And we are located in 2 different sites with a 3rd satellite site at Wright-Patt. So we've got Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam, and we've got Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. And those are our 2 primary laboratory locations. When we bring a case into the laboratory, it undergoes an extensive process before it ever leads to an identification. I kind of wish this slide was animated because the main goal in this slide is to get that little star part right there in the center, right? But you can't reach that without getting all of the other pieces to line up properly. You have to do the historical research to start out the process. You have to make sure you're in the right spot in the world. Then you need to go excavate that spot. Then you start looking at the material evidence that you recovered from that. You do the anthropology, you do the odontology, you do the DNA. When all of those things align down into one thing and it can only point at one person, that's when we make an identification. So it takes all of these pieces working together in concert to make an identification. We don't do it otherwise. So let's have a look at some of those identification processes. So we're going to start with historical research. As I said, World War II, 73,000 unaccounted for service members, but how many P-47 drivers were lost within 100K, 10K, or 1K of a certain spot on the ground? So we'll start there, and then we'll go out and we'll excavate that site. And we know that when we excavated that site, we found a portion of a watch. Now, a watch to us is considered material evidence. It's something that was a personal item that probably belonged to the pilot. So this is going to inform us about who this person was. We know where exactly we found it, but what can we also do with that? Well, maybe, if we're lucky, we can actually associate that piece to an individual based on a photograph. So in this case, We got very lucky. We can tell what type of watch that was. Family handed us a photograph of their loved one. We were able to blow that photograph up, see that watch band on the individual's arm, and match that watch directly to that person. So now we can relate that direct site to him just through that one piece of evidence. So that's part of the process, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to look at what we recovered, and we're going to do the anthropology behind it. For anthropology, we're talking about the age, sex, ancestry, stature, trauma, individuating traits of a human being. We compare all of the data that we generate from that to the antemortem records of the casualty, and we narrow down the search space. Now, anthropology is not going to get you a positive ID. It's too broad, right? I can only say with certainty that someone was between 17 and 19 years old. I can't tell you that they're 18 and 4 days old. It's just not possible. But there are other things that can be possible with anthropology. One of them is called chest radiographic comparison. And within that, what we can do is we can take a post-mortem x-ray of the clavicles and upper vertebral column of the remains that we have in the laboratory, and we can go back to an induction record that we have a antemortem record of this individual because likely they got screened for TB before going into the military. We found a whole ton of these x-rays about 15 years ago in storage. We've reconditioned them, and now we can do a direct comparison between those remains that were covered post-mortem with the antemortem. This is a positive identification. So this is one tool that we have in order to do that, which when you think about it is pretty amazing because this technology really did not exist 15 years ago. The first paper that came out from our laboratory was 2011 on this particular process. So this is just one way that DPAA is pushing the envelope of science forward. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to look at dental. Now, dental is dental comparisons and odontologists are amazing folks. Your teeth are gold mines of information. You wouldn't believe how much information we can pack into a tooth. So, genetically, your teeth form slightly different from everybody else's, right? But there's enough consistency that we have things called dentists that can look at your teeth and fix them for you, right? So you get a cavity. Let's say just for fun, we could say that you get a cavity in a tooth. It's your second molar. And your friend sitting next to your wife, your husband, for some reason, they have the exact same tooth structure genetically. Who knows how that happened, right? But it did. You're identical twins. Anybody? No, probably not. But that did happen. But you went to two different dentists. Well, they both look at that cavity in slightly different ways, and they prep that tooth a little bit differently, and they fill it a little bit differently. Because of that, on an x-ray, it looks different. Therefore, we can make a positive identification based off of an antemortem comparison with dental x-rays. Not so good about doing positive IDs on charting alone, which is the typical way that we see World War II records kept. But starting in the late Korean War, sometimes we'll get a couple of x-rays floating through, and then definitely through the Vietnam War, we have wonderful x-ray records for all of our casualties. Another positive identification method right here. So this one gets me excited. I could stand up here and talk to you guys for 25 minutes, but they're not going to let me do it. I really would. I want to talk to you guys about this one a lot because this is my new fun thing that was come online. We're doing what's called stable isotope analysis now. And what that is we're able to look at the chemical composition of bone. Remember, socks, bone, chemistry, perfect. And we can look at the stable isotopes for carbon and nitrogen that are in your bone and teeth, and we can compare those to world populations and instantly decide where you're from. Now you're like, why is that a big deal? Okay. Well, we get a lot of materials coming into the laboratory that aren't ours. And we send those off for DNA analysis. And if we're doing DNA analysis on materials that aren't necessarily ours, we're slowing down the pipeline on stuff that is ours, right? So this allows us to cut out a lot of the pipe and do triage work for getting down to our casualties. This is a brand new technology. We just brought it on. We just got this accredited in November. So we are the only DoD lab that is accredited to do this type of work in the system right now. Again, pretty neat stuff. I'm sure there'll be updates on this later, but again, this is an exclusionary tool. It tells us big, broad geographic patterns, and sometimes we can get it down to regions in a country. So that's what we're working on next. Okay, good there, everybody? You're not asleep yet. This is DNA, and I'm going to talk to you a ton about DNA right now. I'm just going to bore you to tears with DNA analysis. Nope, there's Tim. Yeah, he's the AFME's AFDIL guy. He's going to talk all about DNA. Just remember, DNA is a tool that we use at the laboratory, and he's going to educate you on that next. But it's going to exclude folks for us and also point us in the right direction on who a casualty is. Now I'm going to pull all of these things together into, hopefully, one line of evidence that shows that how we make an identification. So, here's our case example. Korean War, 7,600 individuals missing right about now. So our baseline search parameter is 7,600 folks. You can watch the numbers on the bottom of the screen there. In late 1950, over 2 days, we had an engagement with the 25th ID and companies of North Korean regulars and also Chinese Communist forces. And from that engagement, 63 soldiers were listed as MIA. Okay, so now I know that my world population for a potential identification has dropped from 7,600 to 63. We went out in the field and we excavated a site that was purportedly to US individuals. And here on the bottom is the field excavation. This is the start of the field excavation in a cornfield in North Korea and then the resulting recovery. When we look at that spatially, we can see that we've got two sets of remains, both overlaid over the top of each other. One is mostly represented by an arm and a pair of legs, and the other by a relatively complete skeleton. Based on the burial pattern, this is not, we didn't bury these folks. You know, this is hasty, right? This is not a formalized burial. This is, folks were just quickly buried. So out of that, then we look at who all was listed as KIA from historical research, found and buried by UN forces. And we know that 42 of those individuals out of the original 63 in that engagement were recovered. That leaves us with 21 who these two individuals could be. Now we're going to turn back to anthropology, and I told you that's not going to be a positive identification, but we're going to look at the things that anthropology can tell us. And what anthropology can tell us is we've got a male, African descent, 17 to 19 years old, about 5'8". I don't know if you all realize, but just about everybody in the Korean War was about 5'8". It just kind of, you know, it was really easy on the military uniforms of the day, really, because you could just swap them around. But yeah, everyone was about 5'8". So how many of those 21 fit that profile? Well, 6 of them did. Okay, so now I'm down to 6 folks. I've got a very narrow group now. And as you can see, what we're doing is we're excluding. So now I'm going to turn back over to that odontology. Now, we don't have x-rays in this case, but what we do is we do have charting. And the charting basically sets it up as I've got a top jaw that's got a large cavity and unerupted third molars, and a bottom jaw that's also got another large cavity on the opposite side, but with erupted third molars. So how many people from that engagement, of those 6, could that be? And we find out that there's only 1. So now I'm down to 1 individual. And again, remember, we're going back to that circle diagram, and I'm looking for that star right there in the center, but I've still got a couple of pieces to go, don't I? Or I can, or maybe I stop here, but maybe I'm going to really make sure that this is right. So, odontology charting, not not the antemortem x-rays, but the charting gets me to here, so that's great. But then we look in the historical record, and here's a letter from mom. I mean, that's amazing. It's a letter from mom that it says he has a considerably large space between his two front teeth. And we go back to those remains, and what's there? A considerably large space between his two front teeth. That's stunning. So now we have an ID. We've got all of those pieces wrapped together. I didn't need to go to that extra piece of DNA. I've got the historical record, I've got odontology, I've got everything pointing to only one casualty that this can be, and it's almost verified by his mother. What this began with was a controlled excavation, solid history. We then looked at the identification from multiple lines of evidence. We pulled all those strings together. And then only when we could compare it to that antemortem data to make sure that it was our one guy, that's when we made that identification. Does that make sense? Cool. All right. That's how we do it, and that's what we're going to do for each and every single one of your cases. When we're given that opportunity, those are the strings we're going to pull. Now I'm going to shift a little bit, and I'm going to talk to you about some of the challenges that we have in the laboratory, and that's in our special projects. But a lot of your cases either will be in a special project or maybe already are in a special project, because special projects to us are these large commingled groups of folks that are all kind of related. Here's the actual total list of special projects that we have at this point in time. So the Korean War project covers all Korea, just because it's easier to kind of put it all out as one group of things to look at. We've got the Cabanatuan prison camp, about 950 unaccounted for. We've got the USS Oklahoma, 388 unaccounted for, but that number is now down to, I believe, just under 200, because we've already done about 180 to 200. No, we just passed the 200th ID, so that one's dwindling, because we're making those IDs right now. Battle of Tarawa, USS West Virginia in California. Actually, the anthropologist who's in charge of that special project is here today. So if one of your casualties is related to that, she's here, you can talk with her. Battle of Buna, the Solomon Islands, and Ploesti. Those are all the major groups that we're working on right now in the laboratory. That's not to say that all of the normal casework that comes in, all of the Southeast Asia things that come in, those are all also worked at the same priorities. These are just special groups that we've got, like one person assigned to overseeing a large battalion of folks underneath them working on. So this is what we're doing there. But a lot of times that these projects are, they're hampered by commingling. So when we go do a disinterment out of the USS West Virginia, what happened back in the day is these ships sunk. The remains gathered on the bottom of the ships. They got commingled. We've actually got photographs of how some of the recoveries were done on like the USS Oklahoma. And it was crazy because they removed remains out of those ships, just bag after bag after bag, because they had been down on the bottom of the floor, ocean floor, for about a month before they could recover them. So these, when they went through processing, they became commingled, and also just the decomposition allowed the bodies to commingle together. So in an ideal world, we have one casket, one individual. But really what happens is, here's an example from the Cabanatuan Philippines camp. We get one coffin, we do DNA, and we end up with 10 different individuals in that one coffin. So our job is to sort these different individuals out, to put them all back together again, and to make the identifications as they come through in those commingled sets. Common Grave 717 was supposed to have 14 individuals in it. We got 13 accessions into the laboratory. I think we're at 19 sequences right now. So it just kind of tells you the complexity of these problems, that the reason folks were unknown back in the day is because they truly were unknown. But we have the tools and the technology today to unsort them and make those identifications. Oklahoma, again, we brought in one casket very early in 2003, and it had 94 different DNA sequences in it. So like a quarter of the individuals associated with that loss were all in one casket. Back then, we had like 10% of the FRS available to make comparisons, so we couldn't do a lot with it. Hopefully, I'm going to make a little plug here, but hopefully if you have not donated DNA, please go see some folks right out there and get a FRS swab. It's the only way we can move forward in some of these very complex cases. Fragmentation, this is out of the Solomon Islands. This is a battlefield recovery. Each one of those blue boxes represents a single individual. That's part of the job that we face. So, bottom line, a successful result comes from controlled archaeological recovery with historical data. We use multiple lines of evidence, and then we compare ante-mortem and post-mortem data together to include FRS, the family reference samples, in order to make that identification. Last year, 217 IDs and growing. Okay, this year we're on track. We're hoping to pace that out as well. So I'll be here all day. So will Laurel and several other lab folks, but if you have any specific questions, please hit us up. Thank you very much.
So good afternoon. I'm Tim McMahon. I'm going to be talking to you about the DNA process. I had a mentor, Mr. Jim Canick, who, when I came in, asked me a very simple question in one of my interviews. He asked me to spell DNA. So I said, oh, being a scientist, I was like, okay, deoxy, D-E-X-O, ribo, R. And he's like, no, I asked you to spell DNA. I went, okay, DNA. And he's like, yes, remember that, KISS, keep it simple, scientist. I said, okay. So my goal is I will try and keep it simple today. I'm going to talk to you about who we are as the Armed Forces Medical Examiner System. I will talk about DNA. I promise I will make it fun. There will not be a test, so you don't have to worry about that part. And then our way ahead in how you fit into this. So as I said, we are the Armed Forces Medical Examiner System. We fall under the Defense Health Agency. We were established in 1990 to assist with performing DNA identification on human remains. And at that time, it was right at the end of the Operation Desert Storm, first Gulf War. So we were doing not only past accounting, we were starting to do current day operations as well. Our mission partner has been the DPAA, or the Defense POW Accounting Agency. For the last 29 years we've been partners in this. And as Greg talked about, we are an accredited crime lab. We became in 1998 the first crime lab accredited for mitochondrial DNA. We've been accredited since then. And what is accreditation? We throw it out there, right? Accreditation is a set of international standards that all crime labs follow, and it's to give you confidence that we are following our procedures and our methods. Well, how does that occur? Well, every 5 years we have to get reaccredited, and what that means is, in our case 2 years ago, they brought in 13 scientists from 13 different laboratories who are specialists in this stuff, same methods we use, and they go through our whole procedures and make sure we're following all of those standards. We were reaccredited with 0 findings last time. First time ever with 0 findings. So, thank you. Why do I put this slide up? Because we're partners. You heard Director McCaig talk about the Defense POW Accounting Agency. We're all under DOD. But I'm under the Defense Health Agency. Why is that important? Because our funding streams are different. So my funding for the past accounting does not come from the DPAA. It comes from a different line. So although we're partners, our funding's different. So it's just to show that slide there. At the medical examiners, again, we do current day operations, we do past accounting, and we do special projects in a worldwide support. So we work with the National Transportation Bureau if an airline goes down. We have a databasing section that does our family reference specimens. We get about 3,000 of those a year. For our present day operations, that's in, we talked about the current Operation Desert Storm. After that, DNA became viable. So right now, I have a little over 7.2 million DNA reference cards on file for all of our active duty reserve and National Guard. We've been collecting them since 1992. That came out of the success of the past accounting mission. So right now I have that direct reference, and because of that, for Operation Enduring Freedom and Iraqi Freedom, there is no unknown service member. We are able to identify all of our fallen heroes. So as part of the NDA 2010, which was that growth to support 200 identifications, this is what we looked like in 2013. I had 6 teams and 45 scientists dedicated just to the past accounting mission. Through support from the DPAA and the Defense Health Agency, this is what I look like as of 2019. I now have 79 scientists underneath me for the past accounting. I have 13 scientists dedicated to the family reference section. So since 2013, I've hired 47 new scientists just for the past accounting mission. In total, I have 145 scientists underneath me, but as you can see, we're well into 90 of those, or over half of them are just dedicated to the past accounting. So when we talk about DNA, I'm going to use a very scientific term, that big blue blob that you see right there. The fancy name is the nucleus. That's the nuclear DNA. That's your DNA. You get half from your mom, half from your dad. Tells you how fast you're going to go gray, what your eye color is, all of that stuff. That in and of itself is the DNA that you hear about in your CSI TV shows or your state, local, and federal crime labs will use. The second type of DNA is mitochondrial DNA, and that's the little squiggly organelles that you see there. Think of those as batteries. They produce the energy for your cells. That DNA only comes from your mom, but where we have one blue copy, you can see we have 10 to 20 of those Duracells. So really, in a single cell, you can have 1,000 mitochondrial DNA copies and 1 nuclear copy. So over time, it was easier to get mitochondrial DNA, and that's why in the 90s and up through 2006, we were really only able to use that maternal reference. I'll talk later now, we can actually use both sides of the DNA, and we're going to talk about that in the future. So when we talk about DNA testing, we're talking nuclear-wise. You hear, that's the golden method. Well, if I was working in the crime lab still, and I was asking who, against the general world's population of 7.6 billion people, left that blood spot on my windowsill when they came in, yeah, I'd have to use nuclear DNA. I have to have that direct comparison using those chromosomes. But when we think of an aircraft that goes down and there's 2 people on it, it's a closed population. I can use maternal references. I can use lineage markers, we call them. Now, when we talk about nuclear DNA, I get 2 tests out of it. I get the same ones your state, local, and federal crime labs. You've heard about paternity tests and sibling tests. I can do all of that. Down there on the bottom is what we call the sex determinant chromosomes, XY for males, XX for females. I actually have a test for the Y chromosome, so that opens up anyone on the paternal side now. So we can go out as far as we need to on the paternal side to be able to support identifications as well. Now, when we talk about the Y chromosome, there's a lot of good markers on there. There are some that I can't really say that they're legitimate or not, but they're published. You know, guys, I'm sorry, there is potentially a selective hearing gene on there. But ladies, I will tell you, we do have the ability to ask for directions. It's called the DIR gene. So, now all serious inside, there are a lot of good useful markers, and it allows us to use that paternal lineage as well. When we talk about DNA, the environment is not our friend. The environment damages DNA. It's called degradation. And this is a very simplistic model. Year 1, I get a full 16-inch piece. For every year, I'm going to take that string and I'm going to cut it. By year 6, I have 32 half-inch pieces of DNA. Well, if DNA broke down that way, it'd be great. It would be great if there was just the human DNA in there, but because it's been in the environment, I have bacterial DNA I get out, and I get all this other stuff out with it. But what actually occurs, if you're really interested in what actually occurs, take that box, unopened box of spaghetti that's in your cupboard, put it on the ground, and jump on it. And then pour it out, and you're going to see all kinds of different sizes. The larger pieces of that bacterial DNA, the smaller pieces of the human. So we have to figure out, how can we get to that human over everything else? And we've done it, and you're going to see how successful we're actually able to support this. Part of that is we have to have multiple mechanisms to travel. Think about it, is we start large and we go after the smaller pieces. So that if you have methods, as you can see on the bottom, mini primer sets we call them, if we have methods to go after smaller pieces, we have a greater chance of getting results. We also utilize, most labs will utilize one short tandem repeat or STR kit. These are the same kits your state and local labs use. We actually have 4 different kits online, because if one doesn't work, we try another one. We're not a one and done lab. We do all the troubleshooting, so that if we report out to the DPAA there's no results or they're inconclusive, I can guarantee you there's not a lab in the world that's going to get that result. We don't quit. We keep testing. This box shows the average. Remember those 32 half-inch pieces of DNA? Well, this is about a 1/4 inch if you think about it. And so DNA really doesn't fit into these modern testing mechanisms, but we figured out how to make these successful. To the point of with STRs, we're about 60% success rate of getting results from these now. So, you hear about nuclear DNA. We should be leading with that sometimes. Well, the problem becomes, if the incident occurred in the last 10 years, sure, mom and dad may still be alive. I can use that nuclear DNA. But what this is telling you is by the time I get to a first cousin, which is a lot of the references that we get, they only share 12.5% of their nuclear DNA with their missing loved one. That means the service casualty, instead of getting me 2 references, are going to have to go out and give me 7 or 8 references so that I can get a good mathematical result to be able to support an identification. So we lead with mitochondrial DNA, and then we use the nuclear DNA to tease it out. And the way I tell people to think about that is a jigsaw puzzle. If I give you a 5,000-piece jigsaw puzzle and I take out all the corner pieces, you'd all want to shoot me. So we use mitochondrial DNA to establish the borders, and then you get those 2 pieces that look subtly the same. Well, then we do the STR testing, find the one that actually fits in there, and that allows us to support the identification. So it's better to utilize multiple tests to get what you want, because inclusion is great because that supports an ID, but exclusions, they're just as important because that's the investigative lead. It guides us more to where we need to go. And so that's where we're using all these different DNA tests. So what's that mean? Well, we're processing anywhere from 700 to 800 samples on a rolling basis per month so that we can report out over 350 to 400 analyses per month so that we can support those 217 new identifications. Our average turnaround time is 55 days. That sounds like a lot, but I forgot to tell you, we have to do everything in duplicate. So for every sample we test, it goes through 2 extractions, it goes through multiple, and the answers have to meet. And so that is 55 days, which isn't that's pretty good since your normal crime lab for a single sample is about 55 days. So we lead with mito again because when we first started this in 1991, that's what modern technology at the time would allow us to go after, is those many copies of the mitochondrial DNA. But because of degradation, nuclear DNA was very, very difficult. So we used that as a additional segregation and conformity test to it, for confirmation. So what's that mean? I tell you everything we do. I show you this pretty Christmas tree graph, and it shows every one of those, but that doesn't mean anything. Sure, last year I did 3,700 analyses that I reported out. But if my success rate was 2%, I mean, we pretty well. Up there, what it means is 94% of the time for a non-chemically treated sample, I get a result, mitochondrial DNA result to the DPAA. 70% of the time, 65 to 70% of the time, STR results. Now, next generation sequencing, we're going to talk about, that's for those chemically treated samples. We've been doing this 3 years, still the only lab in the country that can do this. 3 years ago, our success rate was 35%. We're at 60% now. Okay. So our goal this year now, as you can see, is to go to 4,400 analyses. And within the first 3 months, we're on track to exceed that number. And so the more analyses we get, the greater the chance we can support more new identifications. What's that mean? So for example, last year, I wrote 658 DNA reports. 207 of those are first-time named reports. That means that's the first time that an unknown sequence was consistent to a family reference. So in the 217 new identifications, DNA supported or helped in 207 of those. But 440 of those are addendum reports. So Greg talked to you about all those commingling. There's no magic 8-ball that once we test one sample, we can say, oh, this bone is this, this bone goes with it. We will always have additional bones that we will find in different coffins and so on. So right now we're at 41 first-time named believed to be reports. So already this year, we're looking to be able to support 41 new identifications, and we're only into the first quarter. Why does it take DNA take so much time? That's a question I get a lot of time. Well, we talked about sample quality, the degradation. We need to get the confidence that it's the authentic sequence, so we do everything in duplicate. Problem is, the forensic DNA instruments we use are geared for your crime labs. They're geared for modern DNA samples. So we end up spending a lot of time optimizing, or you're going to see we have to develop a method that's just not out there. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. I'm going to talk about fit for use. Remember I talked about nuclear DNA? Great, crime scene, I want to do, determine who dropped that blood. The fit for use is those nuclear DNA. I got a sample from World War II, and the only thing I have is one first cousin. Nuclear DNA is going to, so it's a fit for use. That's what we're talking about when we think about science moving forward. Here's one. Prior to 2006, the way that we obtained DNA out of a bone, or called extraction, you can see the majority of the bones were not very successful. Well, we developed a big word there, demineralization. I want you to think of turpentine. When you drop turpentine on the hood of your car, it dissolves that paint away. Well, this buffer that we made dissolved bone completely, and really now we have over a 90% success for any bone tested, and it opened up all of the DNA for us. But the bigger part is we went from needing a half a gram of bone, or 2.5 grams of bone, down to 0.2 grams of bone. So it opened up a larger pool that we could actually do DNA testing on. In 2013, our success rate for STRs is only 25%. You saw we're in the 70% range now, okay? Well, remember I told you in the environment, we got all that bacterial DNA and we got all this stuff in there. We had to figure out a way to purify the DNA to get what we wanted. And you know that last cup of coffee nobody wants to drink because it has all the grinds in it? Well, if I took that coffee and I passed it back through a coffee filter, those grinds would stay on top and I get the pure coffee. I actually have a special filter that I can actually put the DNA, and our human DNA will bind to the filter, and we can get rid of everything we don't want. And by doing that, we increased our success rates. So again, optimizing current methods to fit the samples that we have. The Korea Punch Bowl samples, these were the chemically treated samples. Your DNA is packaged into these cells that you can't see without a microscope. But if I was to take your DNA like a Chinese yo-yo, it actually would go from here to the moon. But it gets packaged. And what happened was they package around these little histones, and the DNA that we were getting were in between, about 75 base pairs. So there was no method for that. So it took us 16 years. In 2016, we finally developed a method. We brought it online. We issued the first report in March 17th of 2016. Initially, we could only do 4 to 5 samples per month. We're doing 45 samples per month. We outgrew our current instruments that we actually worked with a company to adopt a new instrument that's used in medical genetic testing, and we're looking to bring that online. So in 3 years, we've done a little over 1,500 samples, and initially it was started for just the Korea War, those chemically treated, but we've been using it a lot with World War II. They've been treated, and we've actually used it with severely burned samples from Vietnam as well. Our success rate is overall, 35% the first year, 60 is about 53%. The big part is that it's led to 147 supporting new IDs in 3 years, just with that method alone. This method is not commercially available. It's something we had to develop in-house to meet the needs. Okay, who are CSI fans? All right, DNA, 45 minutes, right? They get that DNA and they put it in there and they tell you. Well, we're getting close. This instrument here, I could take your swab and in 90 minutes I can get a DNA profile. Okay, sounds great. Not going to work for us. But my current day operations, when the medical examiner can't do a fingerprint or dental ID, we have to do it under 24 hours. We've adopted this to be able to utilize it on those samples. So now instead of having to do 24 hours, we're looking to get it down to 4 hours. Okay, fit for use. Why won't it work? Because it was geared toward new DNA. So here you see a cow bone, you see all that nice little red material in there. That's what it's actually testing. If I take the bone, I'm testing the blood on the bone, not the bone itself. On the cons to it was, again, it was for modern DNA. We tried with bone, it's just not going to work for us. But we are going to use it, current day. So emerging technologies. Unrepaired DNA. So DNA gets damaged. I remember I told you all that green stuff that you see on there, that's bad. It leads to not allowing us to get DNA results. We're working with a commercial entity to see if we can repair the DNA, and there's hope. We're using a DNA repair kit. That same sample went through that kit, and now you can see we've repaired large portions of that DNA. Okay, so we're in the process of seeing, can we repair damaged DNA to get us the results that we need? Genetic genealogy, that's been the big buzzword now. How many people have done 23andMe or Ancestry.com? Okay. Tells who I'm related to, what potential medical issues, what is my heritage and everything like that, right? Well, it came to the forefront in 2018. Everyone remember the Golden State Killer? Okay. Very bad individual. Between 1975 and 1986, crime spree. One of his last sexual assaults in 86, they kept the DNA was starting to come into the forefront. They kept the sexual assault kit. They actually were able to take part of that, put it through basically like an Ancestry.com or 23andMe, and they used a company that has an open database called GEDmatch, and they were able to find a relative and then through genealogy and everything, identify a person who potentially could be the suspect. So that's what they did, right? So again, that was 2018, right? In 2015, we had already started looking at developing something for that. We work with a company called Parabon. We can't utilize the 800,000 targets that Ancestry and 23andMe, it just doesn't work. So my challenge was to them, find me 15,000 that irregardless of your relationship, as long as you're within 4 generations of the missing service member, I can use you. Why is that important? Because if you're a paternal niece, your father is the brother of the missing service member, we can't utilize you right now. This would allow us to do it. And the better part is, these are nuclear markers. So it even leads to a better identification support. So we're in the process of finishing up that 4-year grant. It's actually looking to work very well. And so we will start the rigorous, what we call validation requirements. For example, we went after 15,000 SNPs. We recovered 1,100. And in this case, those 1,100 excluded 5 references and included the correct one. So it's showing that it's actually working with as little as 1,100. And so we're very excited about bringing this online. What does all this mean? We're looking to modernize the approach. We're looking to bring new technology on about every 2 years. Why? Because if I can do it cheaper, and I can do it faster, and I can do it smarter, then I save money, and I can turn around and hire more people. And so all of this is to get to that answer to you, the families, faster. That leads me to my last thing. If you're not sure, we're outside, check with us. We'll be able to tell you what references we have. I can't tell you who the name is. Why? Because we collect those and we treat them as a medical record. They're HIPAA, so we can't give you the name. Now, the database is protected. Your state, local, federal crime lab can't get into my database. The DPA, unfortunately, can't get into my database. The only people who get into my database are my trained scientists. So it is a very secure database. Nobody gets into it. So your DNA profiles only sit within my lab, and there's no outside entities that are able to get into it. So we do protect it very well. I know I threw a lot at you, both on the DPAs, website and on the Armed Forces Medical, there are a series of DNA questions, about 23 or 24 of them, that go into detail on this. And then my contact information is right here. Please do not hesitate to email me. It may take me a couple of days, but I will answer each and every one of you. Thank you very much.
All right, folks, if I can have the briefers come forward, we're going to move into our Q&A session. Rob, do we have the microphone? All right, folks, what I'd like to ask is that for the Q&A session, that the questions, if you have a question, be related to the briefings that were briefed this morning. If it is a specific case-related question, I would respectfully ask that you either get with your service casualty officer or with the DPA analyst that's working on your loss. So with that, again, the same rules. Please just raise your hand and we'll come to you with the microphone. And Rob, we have one right here in the middle.
Thank you. The briefing was wonderful. If I'm understanding correctly, where you needed my uncle was a World War II POW, my dad's brother. I was not eligible to give mitochondrial DNA because my mother is of a different line. Is what you're saying now that I will be eligible to give DNA?
So the short answer to that is, in the future, we're hoping, yes. So we've developed the method. We're showing it's worked. Now we have to do a rigorous validation, which part of that is we actually have to use typical samples. We call them non-probative, that are very degraded. If it stands up and we bring that on, then yes, you would now be a viable reference, as well as any reference that we collected previously as well.
So DPAA would contact me again?
So we would do it through the service casualty offices. So once we bring a new method online, if it opens up a new identification, the belly button to all the family members when it comes to will either be here at a family member update or directly through your service casualty officer.
Thank you.
All right.
Rob. Ma'am, if you could just wait for the microphone, please.
So for remains that are 75 years old, what is the chance of being able to identify the DNA in those remains of that age? Do you have that information?
So yeah, so in fact, the one slide that I talked about there, when you're looking at that if it's non-chemically treated, 94% of the time, whether it's from World War II, Korea, Vietnam, or the Cold War, we were able to get a mitochondrial DNA result. And then when it comes to STRs, it's about 65, 66% for Ys, and autos are about 70%. So there's a good chance at those, even the older it gets, that we're going to generate a result. Some bones work better than others. It all depends, and that's where I rely on Greg and his team. They're experts over the last 20 years. We've actually gotten very good at working with them to be able to look at a bone. They cut it and send it to us, and that's part of some of the success rates that we see. We don't give up, so if it doesn't work under current testing, if we bring something back online, we will work with the DPAA. We talk weekly, daily, and we will reissue, we will reinvestigate samples that didn't previously work, and then look at doing DNA, or as Greg talked about some of his testing, they will reevaluate putting those through there. So we don't give up. We always go back. Yes. Greg, you want to add?
I think you've done it.
All right. Yeah, it's automatically done because, again, as Director McCaig said, our mission is the fullest possible accounting. Where we differ from a lot of commercial entities that help state and local crime is we're not a one and done. We don't give up. We go back and we look at those samples always. Nope. Yep. So the question was, would a family member have to call back in, or do we automatically revisit those issues if it didn't work the first time around? It's an automatic. We're always talking. what drives our research at the DNA lab is always through consultation there, is what are we seeing? What are the anthropologists seeing as a trend when they go to dig up a new, like, Palesti or something like that? And so it's an automatic, and we talk daily on these things.
I will add one small piece. I told Tim that I wouldn't, but I will. The other portion of this is if we had a case fail, let's say a Vietnam case fail back in the early 1990s, our historical teams go back through those, always looking to see, hey, did we do everything that we could have done at the time? Are we up to date? And so there's always this check and balance across all of the systems so that everybody is talking, so that we can go back to Tim and say, hey, Tim, we haven't tested this in 6 years. Do we have enough there? Can we retest it? Can we use a new protocol on this? Is that possible? And that all starts just through communication, and we're doing that constantly.
Well, my uncle was his plane crashed into a mountain in New Guinea, and he burned up in the wreckage. And there were some survivors. So my question is, seeing it's burned up, how does the identification process differ with the DNA, identifying the bones compared to someone that was buried in the ground that hasn't been burned up and probably affected by heat?
So, excellent question. I will look at it from the DNA side, and then I'll pass it to Greg to talk from the anthropology. So heat can actually affect DNA, and that degradation can be increased with the higher the heat. With that being said, due to a lot of the work that we've done with current day losses, especially when working with National Transportation Bureau when an airline crashes, we learned a lot on how to deal with DNA from highly charred, we call them charred remains type thing. But a lot of that success for us comes from the sample that comes to us. And I'm going to turn it over to Greg because he's the expert on that.
In your example, in your case, what we're looking at is a slow-moving aircraft, realistically, that crashed. So how your casualty, as you put it, burned up in the wreckage, is all really dependent on crash dynamics. What we can do is we can look at the bone, as Tim is saying, and I'm not going to send him the most charred piece of bone I can find. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look for something that was shielded from heat. And I can see those heat signatures on the bone itself. And so if I can find a piece that's not been heated, then that's the piece that I'm going to choose to move to Tim, because he's then going to get me the best result possible. Does that help? Perfect.
So, and then one thing is, believe it or not, your teeth actually stand up very well under heat. And so we extract teeth vastly different than a normal lab would do. What we actually do is when they send us a tooth, we actually will drill or cut around the base of the crown of the tooth, because that's where the dental, they look at it. We pop it open, we drill out the inside of it so that we can return the rest of the tooth to the lab, because if that's the only element that was recovered, we want something to go back to the family. So we developed that in 2003-4 timeframe to be able just to go. Most labs will just take the whole tooth and grind it up. So again, we're looking to be able to get to the best results with the minimal amount of damage to the results as well. So.
Addressing myself to Dr. McMahon, I'm wondering, I have, I'm sorry to say, several questions. First of all, when you get a test result from a family member and you test it, do you retain the DNA that you obtained by that sample, or do you dispose of that? Is the only thing you retain the test results? And as to either one, once you identify the remains of a service member, do you have a regulation or a protocol for the purging of that data from your system so it's not available to anyone?
Okay.
Then thirdly, I'm curious as to how complete is the record that you create from your testing concerning the DNA profile, whether it be nuclear or mitochondrial? And how does that compare to what a healthcare provider, a drug company, an employer might want to someday access, notwithstanding HIPAA, to identify you or your descendants' predisposition towards different kinds of vulnerabilities or other things that could prejudice the family members of the person providing that sample?
So those are all very, very excellent questions. I'm going to try and go through them. If I miss one, just remind me. So the first part is how complete, so what do we do once we get the DNA? So we actually collect 3 swabs. Those swabs come in, they are accessioned into my laboratory, and they are given a unique identifier. And that unique identifier is the year, so 2020, F for family reference, and then 0001 for the first swab that we take in 2020. And then each one that we get, so there would be 1A, 1B, 1C type thing. That is what goes into our searchable database. So we anonymize it as fast as we can. The second part is once we extract the DNA and the liquid's there and we get a result, that liquid is retained, but again, it just has that 2020 F number on it. And that sits in a secured evidence freezer that has 3 requirements. A, it's locked. B, it's locked in a room that you have to have been trained in our evidence log mechanisms. So now you have a secure freezer room. I have to put a badge in there. I have to put a PIN number in. That gets me in. I have to unlock it. If I take that extract out, I have to log into the computer in there, take the extract, tell them I'm moving it from that freezer to the next freezer. We call it cradle to grave, so we always have that extract there. The remaining 2 swabs are stored in there. Once we do a test and it matches to it, we do not pull that data out of the database. And there's a reason for that is with certain, there's commonality in the mitochondrial DNA. Now, we are not a genetic testing lab. We are not like 23andMe and Ancestry.com where we are looking at 800 markers across your nuclear genome, and those markers predict disease states, they predict identity, phenotype, and hair color. We're not going. We are going after, for the short tandem repeats or the STRs, the nuclear ones, they are markers that have been shown to not be predictive. That's why they were chosen back in 1998 by the Federal Bureau of Investigation to be the markers that we can test. So what we test for, they have no genetic predisposition. Now, with that being said, as we go into mitochondrial DNA and we sequence the whole mitochondrial genome, there are the chance that there will be disease predictors there, but we don't utilize a software. There has to be specific software to determine what those are. We're not a genetic testing laboratory. But to answer your question further, remember I said my database is only on my network. It doesn't, nobody from the outside can get to it. In fact, Greg here can't even search my database. It's only internal. So again, all of those questions were questions that we had to set up because we come under the GINA Act, or the Genetic Information Act, that was done in 2003, which allowed, because we actually have to collect a reference from Greg and any of his people who touched the sample, myself and all my lab people. We have to put them in there because we have to be able to rule them out as not being the sequence that we obtained. So we have a staff elimination database. Now, with that being said, we do have an expungement policy, it's called. So what that means is if your loved one has been identified and you write to us and say, I want my swabs destroyed, we can destroy those swabs that we have on hand, but I can't take that out of the database. And again, in the database, it's just a unique number right now. You know, it's not tied. There's a whole separate one on that. When it comes to the current day references, for our active duty military, reserve, and National Guard, if they are a NCO or below, when they retire from the military and their DD-214 states that they're not subject to recall and they've made all of their commitments, we don't have a database for them. We just have a DNA reference card. There is a mechanism for them to get their reference card destroyed. If they're an officer, unfortunately, you're subject to recall until 60, and then you can request that your DNA reference card be destroyed. I think I answered all the questions that you asked. Okay. Sir, my email's there if you want. I can give you a card, and feel free to call me, and we can discuss this at any time. I know it's a big concern because with the Golden State Killer, a lot of that came out about your genetic privacy and how, what can, this actually started, believe it or not, between 1996 and 2006. It took 10 years to sequence the human genome. In that time, in 2003, they started this whole idea, well, insurance companies could get access to this. And so there was stuff put into place, this GINA Act, and it's a concern out there. And we've been looking at this for the last 20 years on how to protect all that. Right now, what we look at are non-disease state markers. So. Well, that's why it's yeah. So Greg brought up a good point with the commingling. The reason that we don't take it out of our searchable database is if they ever go back in to do more recoveries and a bone is found, we need that reference there to determine if it's a new ID or a previous or additional portion. So.
I just had a question about how we do the test. I did mine at home. They just sent me the kit.
Mm-hmm.
Is that as accurate as if you did it here?
Yes,
Would you
ma'am.
prefer to have us do it again
Nope.
here? Okay.
No, so so the material that the service casualty would get, they're the same material that we use here. So we've provided all of that information. The great thing is they send it directly to you. There's a FedEx label that brings it straight to my lab. It's the exact same material that we use here. So excellent question.
First, thank you very much. Excellent presentation. My question is, at what point is a family notified that the remains of their loved one has been identified, beginning from the time that one bone fragment is identified as a person, as that loved one? In other words, at what point do you say these are the remains when you go piece by piece of bone fragments? When you don't have a complete skeleton remains.
So DPAA's laboratory is run essentially by a Armed Forces medical examiner who's assigned to DPAA, who has statutory and judicial authority to make an identification. At the point in time that he is satisfied with the totality of the evidence, like I discussed earlier, everything from DNA to anthropology to chest radiographs to odontology to history, when he is satisfied that those meet his requirements to make an identification, he makes the notification, or he makes the identification. That then pushes out a series of triggers to the service casualty officer, and I believe that they have 24 hours in which to notify the family. Is that 48 hours, sorry. 48 hours to notify the family that an identification has been made. That creates a whole other series of triggers that the service casualty folks can work with you on. So, okay, so if we're going to go from, so again, we may or may not have an idea of who that individual is based on the circumstances of recovery. So if I'm understanding this right, so like if we're in Vietnam and we're excavating a site that's associated with RefNo X, Y, and Z, we have a good idea who that is. Those families, when we go to that RefNo, frequently are notified that we have a team in the field at that point in time, okay? They are then notified of results of that recovery, generally speaking. So it's like we found possible osseous material or we found possible life support. They know that then that is going to go through a testing protocol. But if we're talking about a disinterment that's associated with X106, that could be part of any number of 15, 20, 30 families, that is, again, it's available, information that's available to you by contacting DPAA or your service casualty office. they can inform you where that is in the process. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, so you can be informed through your service casualty officer of where that is in the process. And if that individual had been identified as someone else, you would know that that's no longer associated with your case. Mhm.
All the way in the back.
I believe this is for Dr. McMahon. My uncle, it's kind of case specific, but it does lead to something you said, that was shot down in '68. The site was excavated in, I believe, '92, '93, and we were told that the fragments were too small for DNA testing at that point. You mentioned that the size has actually gotten smaller over time and to this date. I'm in the understanding, I'm sure my mom is that all those fragments were then buried with, with the family in Arlington Cemetery. Without the DNA testing, is there any way possible to go back now that the fragments are smaller? Does that make sense?
So it may be a combination. So you're asking, back in the time, when they did the excavation, they recovered a number of bone fragments, some that may have been too small to be tested, some that were larger fragments. Now, is my understanding your loved one was identified?
No.
Okay.
The case
So
has
it's a
been
group burial.
closed, and he has been listed as recovered. However, there was no DNA evidence or no personal evidence at the archaeology site that led to my mom's brother. It was a large crew, a 9-person crew.
Okay.
So, no, specifically not identified, but the crew was listed as recovered because there was not enough
All right,
evidence.
so I'm going to blow this back out a little bit.
Yeah.
So with your question is a common question. There's a number of things to it, but to answer that question is, when we brought this new, and this is where we constantly talk, when we brought this new technology on in 2006, it actually moved to, we were able to start testing fragments that were just about the size of that first knuckle on your pinky, okay? And so we did assess those. What we would need to do is, I think, get with you, Greg and I, get with you and talk more specific offline with your case, because I'd hate to give an answer without knowing, there's a lot of other questions I have about the case before I can actually give you an answer. But to answer your question, yes, if we jump ahead, and this is what Greg says, the historians will look at that. If there are bone elements still within the lab, then if the new technology would allow that, then yes, they would be submitting to us if it was feasible and things like that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yep, thank you.
All right, folks, so if there are no other questions, if we could have a round of applause for our briefers this morning. And then what I'd like to ask of everyone now is to please pull out your agenda for the afternoon. And what we're going to do is I'm going to give it an additional 15 minutes so that we have a little bit longer for lunch. So at 2:15, the Korean and Cold War will be in the Salon 3. Vietnam War breakout will be in Salon 4, and the World War II will be right in here. So again, if I can have everyone back for the breakout sessions at 2:15, then we'll start back up. So at this time, please enjoy lunch. No. So folks, the question was, are the breakouts being referred to as the 101s? So the breakout session will be specifically for each conflict, whether it's the Vietnam War, the Korean Cold War, or World War II.